Welcome to our second webinar on models of refugee integration. My name is Sita Schutt and I'm a trustee of Prospero Wales. Through our fiscal sponsorship program and donor advised fund, we have been working with many charities who support refugees both in the UK and abroad. Welcome again to Pan Intercultural Arts, who work with refugees using the arts, the Trojan Woman Project, who likewise use the arts and have recently launched a podcast called Why Am I in Your Country? Welcome to Better Homes and School for Ukrainians, who assist with housing and education to Ukrainian refugees, and to Phoenix Space, who work extensively in the Middle East, providing outstanding STEM education for refugees and vulnerable communities. So this is our second webinar, and the point that we left off the discussion last time was the difficulty people have when they come from a monocultural society to a multicultural society. Although, as we discussed, it can play out both ways. They can be both traumatized by this or they can welcome it. But this leads us directly into today's theme, which is how we can better manage the perception of refugees by host communities. So before we start this, we thought it might be useful to discuss some of the numbers, although we've already had a debate about the numbers. But just for some context, the UK in the last 12 months had 75,340 asylum applications, of which there are only a tiny proportion of the number of new arrivals. So that's 14% of new arrivals. That compares to France with 142,500 applications, and in Germany, 334,190 asylum applications in the last 12 months. So those figures, I think, are the ones that are official, right? And then just for the global context, we've got 72% of refugees live in neighboring countries to the one that they have fled. Formal numbers indicate that Turkey is the biggest host country in the world with 3.7 million Syrian refugees. And the debate we just had, however, was about the informal numbers, which mean that the number of Afghan refugees in Pakistan are greater, for example. And then, of course, there are more informal numbers that we don't know about. So we don't want to get too much into the discussion of numbers, but just for the final perspective, the UK is home to 1% of the 27.1 million refugees in the world. So that's not that's not displaced peoples, that's actual refugees, 1%. And the reason we want to start with this theme today is that recently there has been an increase in intimidation and in some cases criminalization of NGOs that help refugees, notably in Hungary, Greece, Lithuania, Italy, Croatia, and Poland. But I'm sure you've all read about the case of Ibrahima Ba, the Senegalese man who was steering a boat across the channel and who's just been convicted of manslaughter, despite the fact that he saved 45 of the passengers on the boat. He was not smuggling the boat, he'd been asked to steer the boat. So given this context and where we are today, I'd like to ask each of you what you would do and what your charity is doing to better manage the perception of refugees by their host countries. So, John, I thought we'd start with you.
It's such a massive question, isn't it? I've been working with lots of refugees during this week, and just two things spring to mind. I was working with a young man who was trafficked into this country for the sex trade. He was trafficked over 10 years in 22 different countries and ended up here. But he got into the right hands when he was here. He was put in a safe house, which led him to workshops, to counselors, which allowed him to build his artistic tendencies so that he's now got his right to remain, and he is leading art workshops for homeless people in a homeless charity. He's a complete case of how someone from a dreadful, dreadful story can actually, not just through the arts, but through the help he's being given, flourish. And exact opposite of that, someone who came here 15 years ago and has been part of our organization for 10 years, came here, got a degree in fine art, although he's the only literate member of his family from Afghanistan. But he was never taught how to live in the UK. He comes from a tiny village on the extreme eastern borders of Afghanistan, never taught how to interact with other people, particularly with women. Got into trouble by stalking women, got into trouble not understanding that he couldn't go and knock on their door in the middle of the night and say, "I love you," and was put in prison. And when he came out of prison, he was given no recourse to public funds. He could not stay alive in this country. Tomorrow, He's going back to Afghanistan because he's asked for voluntary repatriation. He was not given the help needed to really socialize himself, culturalize himself into the UK. And I think those two are just show the difference that can happen if we don't have the right frameworks around us to work. What we do with young people is we do try to give a framework whereby they can strengthen themselves through the arts, through creativity, through imagination, to move beyond trauma, so that they can be confident, they can state what they want to do, they can reimagine what they want to do with their lives and go forward. And in one very simple way, just two short examples, one simple way is that now over, well, 70% of our project directors used to be participants. So people who were refugees, who were victims of trafficking, have now become our leaders. That gives them confidence, but it also is a role model for more people coming in who see, I could be like that. I could be as strong as they are. And the parallel example that we give is when we run projects, which I mentioned last time briefly. We run projects for refugees and for host community people, and then bring them together so they see just how similar their real needs are, just how similar they are, and that all the images we get from the bad publicity that comes out of our mainstream media about refugees being harmful to our society is wrong. We're all human beings. We have so many needs in common. I'll stop there.
Just one question, John. These stories are often about vulnerable people, and I know that PAN as a charity doesn't like to publicize too much because they are still vulnerable. But how could you better, or how could that message or those stories be shared in a wider context?
Well, we're working on it by anonymizing people, and by now we've got to a point where people have been with us long enough that they want to be advocates for it as well. And so those people sort of come to the forefront. Those people know that it's important to get the message across, and that's part of what they've learned with us, that you can find ways of expressing your message to people. But I'm working with obviously with our comms and marketing people to get those out there. Sometimes it has to be anonymous, and we have to be sure that they are ready for it before they can actually tell their story. But it is important.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next? Valeria?
All right, Valeria, go.
Hi, yes, thank you so much, Sita. And yes, I'd like to pick up on what John just mentioned about the commonalities of all of us. And I think for the thing about us is because I'm from Ukraine, and us in BHSU, most of us are what is called of the community. So we are Ukrainians ourselves. And we actually do a lot of, and part of our work, we feel part of our mission is to connect and reach out to our UK host community as much as possible, and just to make these connections. And I think once people kind of meet you and, they can relate to something that is larger and be, behind you, so to say, this abstract war or a problem that's happening there somewhere. Once you meet a person and you're able to connect and interact, and you do realize that people are very similar. And I think the problem with the media generally, is tends to focus on the negative. We all know that. That's a whole different discussion. But showcasing any goodness, any good, as John said, role models or just stories that could be inspirational. And I think for us as well is, taking the shift from, I think there's the general kind of narrative of there being limited resources, and then with refugees coming in, the perception is like, oh my God, we have limited resources, and now we need to share it with some, other people, and we need to flip that and rather see it as a growth opportunity. We're not, trying to share a limited resources. We can increase the resources that we are creating together, and how can we enhance the new communities that are being brought together through a terrible situation, through a conflict or a disaster or something that makes people travel across borders and try and look for a new home. How can we enhance this? And there's so many good things that have come out of the interconnectedness of all of us everywhere. So yeah, the little we can do by personal examples, by highlighting stories, by building connections within the two communities. And I think once the shift is on the empowerment of each individual human being, rather than, kind of belittling them and not giving them the empowerment that is needed, then we can all find a nice solution and live in a different world, essentially.
Valeria, thank you so much. Do you think you could give us an example of one of the activities you do to bring together host communities and refugees?
Yeah, well, we had a very small example. We had a little thank you reception that was organized by Ukrainians that have invited hosts that have hosted them for the first, 6 months or a year when people came to the UK, for example. So that was a nice kind of appreciation reception that Ukrainians have put on for the hosts, and there was a lot of sharing and tears and connectedness in that, for example.
Thank you. Willie and Lottie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I would say that our project, Treasuring Women Project, is really a communications device. One of its two main planks is for people to tell their stories of exile and loss and coming to a new country. And the basis or the aim behind this is to take it, these numbers are scary. 5 million unofficial Afghan refugees in Pakistan, 3.7 Syrian refugees in Turkey, 750,000 odd, whatever the figure is, of net migration into Britain. People look at those numbers and they go, my God, we're full up. That's the size of a town, equivalent to Milton Keynes or whatever the hell it is. A sizable sizable city. What we do is take it down to the personal, because although people are predisposed, we should say this, to be suspicious of people from other places en masse, they are also predisposed to look at people individually and say, well, I don't like this bunch of people, but I do like him or her because they're my neighbor and I've got to know them. So our point is really to say, these are people just like you plus a catastrophe. And, you would be jolly glad if the same thing happened here, to be treated fairly wherever you went. Valeria's point about it being an engine of growth is important. There's an uptick in companies looking for foreign labor because they can't fulfill the labor shortages here, even in a time of stagflation. So it's the personal. Bring it down to the personal the whole time. You cannot deny someone's own story. It's very powerful. And so that's why we have people on stage who've written their own story, sewn into one of the most ancient stories of being a refugee or of exile, to show that this is something that happens the whole time, happened throughout human history. And these are people like you.
And the reason why we launched the podcast really is a multiplier of the reach of this, because, with our plays, which, always, are very well received, and we get standing ovations and the audience always cries, and, we have a lot of press coverage generally. It's still a limited number of people who can get into a theatre, but with a podcast, it's a massive, massive multiplier of the reach. And the whole kind of podcast thing has really revolutionized our ability to reach other people. And the films, we always make films of our work exactly for this reason, as a multiplier of the reach. And through those films, these stories are studied at universities all over America through our films, and the UK, and also went on BBC Arabic, a while ago now. But really, it's a question of working out a way to get the stories out there as widely as possible. And a friend of mine was listening to the pilot episode of our podcast the other day, and she said, my God, it must be so awful for her being in a refugee camp. She sounds so cultured. And that is exactly the kind of, link, that bond that one wants to make people realize that this is you. This could be you. It could be you.
I think it's also quite clever that you used a love story in your first podcast, because that is also something that's universal, isn't it? So the story that, one of the big issues
in Britain, a dog is important.
Sorry?
The next one is going to be about
the dog, absolutely.
the next
Well,
one's
the point is people forget that, something like a love story will still be preoccupying people as they flee. It'll be not, where will I eat next? It'll be like, oh, that boy that I like, or that,
Also, the other
so
point
that's very
about that story is that how refugees can enrich the host communities. Basically, Arwa has rescued this kind of slightly sort of down on his luck Brit, and now he's happy, a father, employed, housed. So yeah, she couldn't have done
So
better.
I
No,
think what's
that's
interesting about what you said, Lottie, was the multiplier, because I mean, the big question I have is how do you increase the surface area of connections? So each of you working in quite, with small groups of people, how do people meet and learn about an individual story? And they might listen to a podcast, but it's actually the human interaction that can cause people to change their minds the most. So Alevtina, what would you like to add to this?
Well, thank you. Just to continue on the theme of growth and empowerment, as you've said, thank you for introducing us. We're educational charity providing future-ready education and training opportunities for refugee children and youth, with particular focus on skills and competencies needed for the jobs of tomorrow. So we focus on sustainability, and in that we try to challenge this narrative that refugees are humanitarian matter. And instead, we sort of emphasize the fact that by unlocking the potential contributions of refugees themselves, we're creating this enormous human capital that in time will, with nourishment and development, will bring enormous benefits to the refugees themselves, to their families, to the communities and the hosting communities. And so, as you know, we're on the brink of reskilling revolution with, what's the figure, 1 billion jobs liable to be transformed by technology. And we occupy this niche role by providing training and reskilling opportunities to the most marginalized and vulnerable members of our society. And basically, by harnessing this productivity potential, there will be a reaped dividend in future. And also, don't forget that the focus on reskilling is also instrumental in improving social mobility and reducing inequality in a hosting community. So just to throw one figure, improvement of just 10% in social mobility will boost economic growth by 5%. And we think it's a very powerful story to be telling, in short.
Thank you. I mean, that, it is very inspiring. And so my question is, how can the communities in the countries that you work in, how can they find out more about how you're phrasing what you do? Because that can be inspiring rather than create fear, because maybe they'll think, oh, well, then they'll get really good at that and take our jobs, for example.
Well, sure. First of all, by training by educating the children and youth, by training them, giving them the tools and the skills, we enable them to enter the job market, and that by itself is the sort of the PR campaign for you, because, and obviously we try to communicate as much as possible and publish, oh, this guy became data analyst here, or this, this girl became marketing manager here. But by occupying, sort of by getting the jobs in the knowledge economy, they by themselves, they become a massive PR machine, and we hope to, with time, reap the benefits of that.
So basically, the proof is in the pudding. It will be in the pudding. Thank you so much. So our second question was about processing, because we had a little chat about the fact that it's often the backlog of, I mean, in this country, and I'm sure it's the same in places like Germany, France. I don't know about Turkey. Is there anything that you've come across that makes you has given you ideas of how processing of asylum seekers can be improved or accelerated? And I think, Valeria, you had a lot to say about that. So let's start with you on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sita. Yes, as we were discussing, again, coming from Ukraine, which is a country that before we used to need visas to go anywhere. So if you need to plan any visit anywhere, you need to apply for a visa, like a permission to entry. And only since 2017 has Ukraine gained visa-free status with the EU countries. So it meant that when the war broke out in 2022, the full-scale invasion, it meant that we could, without asking for permission to entry, just enter Romania, Poland, and the neighboring countries, and remain in the EU within the 90 days with a visa-free situation, which was already amazing, and we don't take it for granted. Even if some years have passed since then, and we're kind of used to it. But in order to request entry to the UK, then there was a system, as some of you may know, that was kind of pulled together very quickly, but we did have to wait for 2 or 3 months for the government to provide this Homes for Ukraine scheme. And the brilliant thing about that, I thought, because having to apply for a UK visa for 20 years before that, was that you didn't need to go physically to any embassy. You didn't need to get paperwork, in proper paper stuff, because of course we didn't have anything. If you're fleeing from war, you can do everything digitally, and then in time even there was an app that you could use to prove your identity. So it just proves how actually the technology that we have now is amazing, and how you can actually shorten, quicken and simplify the procedures for all people involved. And it was, I think in the end, there was quite a quick turnaround. And looking back at it, we were all thinking, my God, if the UK government can do this for 20,000 applicants from Ukraine, then potentially this technology can be used across the board with other countries. And what I also wanted to say, which we've touched upon previously, when we got to the UK and we were exploring how do other organizations help other refugees, and what is the experience behind it, a lot of people have said that actually the scheme that was applied to the Ukrainians, thousands of displaced Ukrainians coming in, was like a result of several waves of kind of crisis refugees that UK had to deal with before, and that they were learning from it. And I think that the scheme that was adapted was the ones that was used most recently in 2019 for BNOs fleeing from Hong Kong after a certain crisis there. And again, so there was already an understanding that perhaps the asylum seeking route needs reform and is something else. But we already have this BNO scheme. Let's look at it. They revamped it. It's not exactly the same, but it was used to apply for Ukrainian scheme, and it worked, I think, overall in a very, very good way. So I think that's brilliant, and hopefully that can be expanded across the board. So hopefully there's a bit of positive there. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to comment on what Valeria's just said in terms of your experience of helping refugees go through the processing period?
Sorry.
Go.
Please, you go ahead.
Okay. No, only that it's great that you've had this positive experience. I have to say, in the 20 years of working with refugees, almost none of us have had an experience anything like that. When we first started, we were working with 16 or 17-year-olds who were fearful of their 18th birthday, because they would then have to go into a system whereby they would receive a letter which said the Home Secretary demands that you appear at such and such a date to reclaim your case for refugee status. So there's a legal responsibility for under 18s, but as an adult, you have to reclaim it. And they would then be in a list, which in those days was 3 years before they would get a decision. There are many different figures about how many are on the waiting list at the moment. But there are over 100,000 people on the waiting list in order to have their asylum. Thank you. To have their asylum case heard. That's even if they've been able to lodge an asylum case. And those who are coming across and who are deemed illegal immigrants, although there's no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker, are not even allowed to lodge an asylum case. So the system is totally broken. When people do come through it, and those find a way through it, I was talking to someone yesterday morning whose girlfriend was in the Home Office in Croydon, and he was waiting for her outside because she had the interview which would determine whether she could stay or not. He had his interview a few months ago and has got his right to remain, but it was a 7-hour interrogation in which he said they asked me the same questions time and time again, hoping that I would make a mistake. His English is not great. It's just about good enough to do it. We've created a hostile environment, and we have to deconstruct a hostile environment and remember, as other countries are doing, that refugees are who we are. Refugees are valuable to society. I have a lovely statistic here that 1 in 6 people in the UK may be descended from Huguenots, who were the first refugees in this country who brought us the word réfugié, which has become our word refugee. But we've made the hostile environment, and that is blocking us from almost everything we do.
Just to add to that, because we were having a conversation last night about more broad-ranging than just the Home Office system and asylum seeking, is that in essence the difficulty of getting anything done in this country when faced with a public body is a form of rationing, and it is designed this way. This is a theory which I think is not mad. That it is designed to ration resources by weeding out faint hearts and by ensuring that you do all the work rather than paying someone else to do the work. Whether it is efficient or not, I doubt. But again, I think the asylum system does need to be reformed and changed and brought up to date, like all other civil service operations. Anyway, that was just my 2 pieces.
So Arwa, who's one of the women that we work with, who claimed asylum here in 2018, and it took about a year and a bit for her to get her refugee status. She's a Syrian here illegally, and she said in her year of living in Rotherham in a hostel surrounded by other asylum seekers, she said it was really for her quite clear that it was whether you were lucky or not, whether you had a caseworker who was on the case and enthusiastic. She said there was an Iranian guy who got his in 7 days, hers took 11 months. And but I mean, anecdotally, to be perfectly honest, given there was a range of people that we work with, in my experience, the people who really deserve to get, be allowed to stay here because they really are feeling something dreadful, it takes about a year, but they get it. The people with a slightly dodgier case, that takes much longer. And that's the sort of logic behind it, I think.
The logic being that they wish to, not accept refugees. Refugees, asylum seekers who come from places they regard as being safe, but they also take into account domestic problems as well. So it's not a question of coming from a peaceful country. It can actually be a question of coming from a country where you are in fear of your life, whether it's politics or indeed domestic.
So we've got 2 people we work with, both of whom were for fear of their life domestically. They both come from safe countries, and they both got their refugee status within a year, or just over a year. They both got it now. But there are a couple of other people who come from countries that would definitely be deemed safe, and they've been here for many years. And one of them only got his after about 17 years, didn't he?
Yeah.
Thank you, Lottie and William. We've got to speed up a little bit because it's nearly 1 o'clock. So Alevtina, you wanted to add something to that, I believe.
I'll be very, very quick. And I think it's fair to say that all of us here belong to a sort of one ideological bubble. And we think that, the policymakers are just sitting there and thinking of the ways to reform the system. And I actually don't think there's a problem with the system. I think it's a problem with incentives. And as Valeria said, we had an incredible response to the Ukrainian crisis here. The restrictive nature of UK refugee policy, but the response wasn't a norm, and this preferential treatment and allocation of resources was basically done at the expense of other nationalities and other groups and other communities. As you said, Lottie, the people basically were put on a backlog, and waited for a year and a half for their applications to be processed. So, and the response to the Ukrainian crisis we had was the factor of public support, basically. And so the policy making is, as in terms of refugee issues, is reactive. And on that note, I think basically a lot is to be said about the power of narrative. Okay, and
sorry.
Sorry, and it probably brings to another point. How do we, as a society, change this narrative? What is our role here? And again, for the example, I'm a huge advocate of education not only of those who are coming here, and of course, as an immigrant, I can also attest to the fact that I felt it's my duty and responsibility to learn the culture, the language, the ways, you know, to appreciate and respect the society that is my home. But it's, you know, the integration is twofold. And we as a society can also do a part in making this integration a seamless process. And I, for instance, think there should be a educational module for schools on refugees and general situation in the world, because humanitarian crisis, it's not going away. You know, the figures, I think, you know, that are thrown away, sort of the predictions, climate refugees will constitute what, from 200 million to 1 billion. I mean, you know, it depends which statistic you're looking for. You know, 1 billion people displaced. That is a massive problem. And, you know, of course, you know, we can react by closing the borders, isolating ourselves. But in this integrated world, entangled world, it's like dealing with, you know, financial crisis, basically going to the bank, withdrawing your money, but then contributing to the financial crisis that will have, you know, far greater repercussions for you personally, for society, if you know what I mean. So we also need to basically think what would be our contribution to the process.
I absolutely agree, and that brings us to the final point, which is ways in which refugees can be seen. What are the stories about the enrichment? What have you experienced? How have refugees enriched the host communities you work with, or the countries indeed that we live in? I just wanted to say that I think the idea of having a module in schools about why you know, what it means to flee from a war, persecution, reasons for displacement, that would be huge, just to at least teach young people, you know, where people are coming from, why they need a home, and how we are all in this integrated world. And if we don't help, then it might be us next, right?
Yeah.
So let's I'm aware that we're going slightly over time, but that's okay. I think this is really important. So let's talk about examples of enrichment.
Okay.
John, let's have some stories about enrichment.
Ooh, I mean, I meet people all the time who change my mind about how I see the world. And they are refugees. They are people with different points of view, different cultural perspectives. They challenge me all the time. And one of the great things about living in the UK is that we do have these intersections of ways of seeing. And I think not only do I get enriched, but each individual refugee I see gets enriched and finds new possibilities for themselves. And just as in our history, there are thousands of very, very successful refugees who have made the UK what it is today, from the Mini designed by a refugee to Marks and Spencer's being started by a refugee, and so much more. We are constantly in this very rich development going forward. And I just happened to see something today, a speech given by a recently short-lived female prime minister of this country, who made a speech saying, if we sort out the refugee crisis here, then every household will be £1,330 richer each year. And this is lunatic. We have a deficit of labor. We actually need people in the country, even if you take it on just on that raw economic level. And behaving like Germany did and like New Zealand does, of saying we need people to come in and help us. And we will put into place the ways of integrating them into our society, so we become a richer society, both culturally, intellectually, and in economic terms. And that's what we all have to do to fight against these attempts to demonize the refugee.
I think that's absolutely sure. I think in terms of enrichment, no one has ever said, oh, you know, we let in far too many Jews in the 1930s to the UK. No one ever said we let in far too many Protestant Frenchmen, you know.
Lebanese people in the...
No one's ever said that in the past. It's always a thing that, but at the time,
there's a panic.
There was a panic. Oh my God, who are they? Flooding into the East End, you know, we don't know them, they speak a different language, they've persecuted somewhere else, there must be something wrong with them. So, you know, hindsight's great, but I think in terms of enrichment, people are eager to, odd individuals, but mostly people are eager to pay back to the country that's taken them. Because don't forget, most of these refugees have not come straight from the country they have fled. They have been in other neighboring countries and realized that their lives could not, for years, and sometimes realized their lives could not work there, and have either under some settlement scheme or through just getting here and claiming asylum, have come to a place they believe their lives can work, and they are eager to repay. But I think that it is really important that where they are locally, local authorities, local organisations, small local organisations, not great big pan-British, pan-UK or pan-Scotland, England, Wales, whatever, they should, that there are those people in place who want to meet, talk, help, improve English, etc., etc., and find out what people want to do,
I mean,
and what they can do. But you can't, this is a really important part of getting people to understand locally what people can do, and also for those refugees to understand that there are people helping them. They will then feel the obligation as well. But you can only do it really in small local groups within each authority, etc., within parishes or communities.
Okay, I'm actually also looking for more tangible examples. For food is one. Restaurants,
food is very obvious.
Music.
Stop hard. Stop hard.
Yeah.
There's Emily Maitlis, Sir Clive Moser. They all, Thomas Thomas' family were refugees. Emily Maitlis was Clive Moser's family, came here as a child of the Kinder Transport. Food, really obvious one. Silver from the Huguenots. The great banking dynasties of our nation. Comedy.
Richard Rogers, the architect, refugee.
Lots and
Everywhere.
everywhere.
Prime Minister,
Prime Minister, our
Secretary,
secretaries,
Mayor of London, politics, I don't know.
all of it.
Freddie Mercury.
Music, arts.
Absolutely. But I think that, don't you think that at a local, that people need the reminder of this? Schools and local, there needs to be a constant reminder. Especially starting with food. And you were talking about ottolenghi and recipes at one point, Lottie. And I think that's something that people forget. They just make the food or eat the food or go to the restaurant, but they forget that this is part of why their lives are richer.
Every war brings a wave of new restaurants, So when we were child anyway, it was Lebanese. For my parents' generation, it was Chinese. The Chinese takeaway suddenly appeared. I mean, every small town in rural Scotland has a Chinese takeaway and 2 Indian restaurants,
and also an Italian ice cream shop.
Italian ice cream shop. Every single time. So
finally, now there's at least there's like 3 or 4 new Ukrainian restaurants in London. There used to be, we used to be always taken to Polish restaurants, which was like the closest possible.
There was only one, 2, Polish club and Daphne.
And just on that, can I just give a quick example as well on a tangible example, because of course Poland being the biggest border with Ukraine, and most of Ukrainians refugees or displaced Ukrainians are currently in Poland, and Poland had to pay the biggest kind of amount of money to support that influx of people. But within less than 2 years, the impact of those people being in Poland has proven that the GDP growth in Poland has grown much more than predicted because of these people and the contribution to their taxes was already more than what Poland had paid to welcome them in. So also within a very, very short time.
That's not happening in this country, and it's really interesting. So one of the things that we've come across with refugees here is they're finding it really hard to get jobs. And I think it's part of the kind of computer says no culture in this country. So there's one of the women that we work with is a very, very, very experienced teacher. She's sort of, all her qualifications are valid in this country, and she's been trying to get a job, and she doesn't have a registered teacher's number.
And we're crying out for teachers.
And we're crying out for teachers. And I personally think this is entirely personal that the productivity has gone down in this country, which it has, with the rise of this absurd always apply online in a form that takes 45 years to fill in. And has to be done correctly, like my problem with the BBC today. It's taken a week and has failed. If you put these enormous barriers up to entry, people won't actually, in the end, be able to enter. the workforce. And the other thing that's completely insane is the fact that asylum seekers, I have to be quite careful what I say, but the asylum seekers are not allowed to work legally in this country. And I feel that they should be allowed to work legally, but they should be taxed. They don't want to, they're amazed when they come here and discover they can live for free and aren't allowed to get work. I think it's completely absurd. They should be allowed to work legally, forced to work legally, actually, as part of the asylum process, and taxed. And the money should be held in some form, and they should give allowance. And then when the decision is made, they should get given the rest, the balance as a payment, either to help them go back home and get repatriated, or to help them build their new lives.
Or it might be go towards points towards their asylum. I don't know, but anyway, it is insane.
I think that's a useful idea. Aleftina, would you like to say something before we wrap up?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I agree with everything. And in terms of celebrating this refugee culture or diversity, really making it as part of our multiculturalism and diversity sort of celebration, I think it should not be limited to Refugee Week. We should really make a concerted effort to do it as a proper sort of a part of formal education. For instance, Holocaust. The only historical event that is compulsory in our curriculum, and we should include, as I said, the module there as well. And talking about celebrating, the refugees. This, if Michael Marx wasn't fleeing persecution in Belarus, and fear of anti-Semitic pogroms, you wouldn't have Marxist fences. Again. I think not enough people actually understand or look at the composition of our government, for instance. This Home Secretary's mother was from Sierra Leone. Okay, she may not have been a refugee in the legal sort of understanding of it, or immigrant. Anyhow, and I think these things should be taught explicitly and not just talked about, and it will go a great way.
I think it's one of
and there are books and there are poems we should all be reading. The wonderful poem Home by Wasson Shire, Benjamin Zephaniah's Refugee Boy. These are books which every child and every adult should be reading.
So I think
on that note, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to wrap up. So on that note, can we just each of us recommend a film, a book, a podcast, something that you think? Well, we've had John, you've already given yours. What would you all recommend?
Well, apart from our podcast, Why Am I in Your Country, I would recommend a film called Limbo, which is about asylum seekers in the Outer Hebrides, and it won a prize at Cannes in 2020. It's a black comedy. It's exquisite. It's a marvelous film.
Beautiful film.
Okay, we'll add that to the list at the end of this. Valeria, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think I mentioned the film that really impacted me is The Swimmers, about the girls from Syria. It's really touching.
I'm going to watch that. I haven't watched that yet. Aleftina?
I would recommend a film that was very, very tough to watch, Last Man in Aleppo, but it did change my life.
Yeah.
So, in fact, to continue on this education path, I would put it as a not recommended but compulsory watching for schools, for high schools.
Thank you all so much. We did go over the time today, but I think it was worth it. And what we'll do when we put this up for people to watch, we'll add a reading list. So please send through any other recommended reads, films, podcasts. Thank you all so much. Our next webinar will be moderated and not exclusively include refugees, so that they actually have a platform to say what they want to say, and we'll be listening along with others, hopefully. So we'll be letting you know the date for that. And I've really enjoyed today's discussion. Thank you all so much for your thoughts and your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for organizing.
Thank you for arranging it. Thank you for moderating it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.